Hi, I'm Samuel Prather, Reason user since 2003. Welcome to A Reason to Create. Today what I wanted to do was just take a second to finish off one thing that I left out of my last video on mixing. If you haven't checked out the other 2 or 3, just check those out so that this one makes sense, even though it kind of is self-contained. What I realized was I forgot to talk about sidechaining on my last video where I talked about bringing everything together. And that's fine if you don't sidechain on jazz or folk or music that's a little bit lighter, but if you're really trying to get things to pump, then that's something you should definitely be thinking about doing. When I sidechain, I really try to think about things in terms of subtracting. So if there's something that I want to be louder, then I make it louder by subtracting it from everything else instead of making it hotter in that one channel. The reason why we want to do this is subtracting from everything else as opposed to adding to the one channel allows us to make that crest factor even smaller, which allows us to have a louder mix in the end. Generally speaking, I'm trying to get either the vocal, the kick drum, or the snare drum to be more up front without blowing the balance on my mix. So what I'll do is I'll send everything else to a multi-band compressor so that it can kind of duck in the frequencies that I think are appropriate for each instrument. More specifically, I would call this multi-band ducking, not just sidechaining, because I'm going for specific ducking on specific frequencies to make all 3 of those elements be able to fit better in the mix. For the kick drum, I want everything 100 Hertz and below to duck every time it strikes. For the snare drum, I'm thinking more along the lines of the mid-range, probably around 200 to 500 that I want everybody else to be out of the way of so that I can have a little bit of more bottom to my snare. And lastly, for the vocal, I probably want 5K and above to be ducked for everything else so that I can get a little extra brightness out of the vocal without actually adding harshness to it. All right, so let's take a look on the computer and I'll show you how I do that. Reason does have a free multi-band compressor combinator patch. It works, but the one I'd actually recommend is the 4 Dyne multi-band compressor. It's cheap, it's very effective, and every time you pull it out, you'll be glad that you have it. So here we are on the computer. I've already cleaned everything. I've already got some notching going on. It's actually a pretty balanced mix, at least for what I want to hear. But let's say I really wanted to get just punched in the chest with this kick drum. Or, the snare drum, I want it to be punchier, but I don't want the balance in the mix to be just completely blown. I'm going to create a new output bus. And I'm going to call this kick ducking. So now I've sent everything that's not the kick to the kick ducking output bus. If I click on the rack to go to the device, show the programmer, I'm going to drop in an instance of that 4 Dyne multi-band compressor, and I'm going to start out with 3-band basic compression. Now I'm going to go to the kick, hit tab to see the back, and I'm going to add a utility here. Basically, I'm going to take the signal from the end of my kick's chain and I'm going to split it so I can send the other end to my multi-band compressor on the side chain input. You'll notice that I have all these options: kick ducking, mix channel, and I'm going to send it to side chain left. Now when I go there into the side chain in, that tells the compressor that that's the signal that we're going to use to know when to compress everything else. For the kick ducking part, I just want everything under 100 to be compressed a little bit when the kick drum strikes to make more space for it. And even though I labeled it kick ducking, I'm gonna also do the same process for the snare so I can show you how this works in a multi-band capacity. All right, I put that in band 2, sidechain left. And if I had a lead vocal, then this is where I would sidechain probably the top end. We know the sidechaining was successful because the little LED indicator on the multiband compressor lights up red. Because I have the snare as a modifier, I don't want it in the multiband compressor anymore. I want to treat it separately. If we solo it, now remember, the idea is not to be drastic. 3 to 6 dB tops off of this if we want it to be subtle, but that little bit that you snatch back to give more beat to the snare and more bottom to the kick drum is going to do it without making your track kind of blow through the top of the peaks. That's really all there is to it. Whatever you want to be louder, you just subtract whatever frequency you want in that to be louder from everything else. And you can do that to up to 4 different frequency ranges with the multi-band compressor. Remember, when you're mixing, there's no one silver bullet that will take care of all your problems and make your track clean and loud. You have to remember that it's little layers of things that are going to add that volume that you need to get that commercial master to really crank when it gets in the speakers. The other thing that you can do once you've split off all of these other parts from the kick and the snare and the lead vocal is now you can add in a stereo spread to that track specifically. If I go to that multi-band compressor, I can just slide in a stereo imager. Without, with. And all together. Okay, so please remember that stereo imaging is not something that has to be handled in the mastering phase. The one that's in the mastering suite is great, free, and then you don't have to worry about, that whole part of it later on in the master. Hopefully I gave you some good info today. If I did, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when I come out with new content. I'm Samuel Prather. Hopefully I gave you a reason to create.